Thank you for joining us this evening. You are now attending the webinar entitled Promoting Equitable Teaching During the AI Literacy Crisis. Our leader for this session is Antonio Byrd, Assistant Professor, Humanities and Social Sciences at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. We're also joined by two members of our Teacher Advisory Council, Sara and Derrick Walker, who will be active in the chat, sharing thoughts and resources and asking questions throughout the evening. Antonio Byrd teaches courses in Black literacies, professional and technical communication, multimodal writing and rhetorics, digital rhetoric, and composition. He researches how the legacies of liberation carry forward into Black digital literacies with special focus on Black adults learning and using computer programming. His work has appeared in College Composition and Communication, Literacy and Composition Studies, Technical Communication Quarterly, and Writer Craft and Context. His current book project is tentatively titled The Literacy Pivot, How Black Adults Learn Computer Programming in a Racist World, and is under contract with the WAC Clearinghouse University of Colorado Press. Dr. Byrd also serves on the steering committee for UMKC's Center for Digital and Public Humanities. His work in digital and public humanities focuses on community-engaged scholarship and digital literacy by connecting UMKC students with community partners and industry professionals for real-world application of digital writing. And as I mentioned earlier, Dr. Byrd is one of our featured experts in our Artificial Intelligence and Digital Literacy Institute, which we're hosting this summer out at the Hall Center for the Humanities at the University of Kansas. So to everyone who's here tonight, and without further ado, I present to you our leader for this session, Dr. Antonio Byrd. Dr. Byrd, we are honored to have you with us tonight, and we look forward to hearing your talk. Thank you for joining us. I hope all is well.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Mike. Hello, everyone. Good evening. Thank you for taking your time here to join us here on the webinar. I just want to start off by continuing my thanks before we get started. First, I also want to thank Raven Ferguson and also our TAs, both Sara and Derrick, for interacting with you all in the audience chat. I really appreciate your work to really make this happen and bring me to you all for this webinar. So I want to just kind of talk a little bit about this topic, specifically promoting equitable teaching amidst the proliferation of generative artificial intelligence. And it poses a lot of challenges to my own teaching philosophy. So I want to start off with just my own work at the University of Missouri, Kansas City, and how generative AI is really posing some challenges to my approach to teaching in my writing classrooms. So, for example, in my department, I kind of fill a gap in our English major program. I teach students the full range of the different ways that they can pose with technologies. So I teach podcasts, I teach board games, and I also teach professional communication. That doesn't mean that my colleagues don't assign creative assignments in literature or rhetoric, but I come into the department with the expectation that, hey, teach our students a lot of different types of technologies. So I like to joke that when you don't want to write an essay, you come to my classes. But ultimately what I'm doing is teaching digital technologies, and I'm often trying to do that through what I call liberatory pedagogy, and I'll talk a little bit more about what that really is. So this is what I mean. Here are some of the challenges that I face from generative artificial intelligence, and a lot of these you're probably familiar with already. There's the issue of bias in the training data and what the outputs are. There are issues with hallucination, with information being made up that aren't really true. There's issues with labor. We're thinking here about how there are people who are actually working with these different tools and making sure that they present outputs that are really presentable to their users, that aren't offensive to the users. And often those are Black laborers, Kenyans, for example, who are paid very little to work with the outputs while training generative artificial intelligence. And then finally, of course, there's the issue of climate. I can explain that image that's there on the left-hand side. That is an image of the Kansas City Star building, and that building has been abandoned since 2020. The newspaper here in Kansas City, they decided to go ahead and clear that building out. It used to be used for printing, and just a few months ago, it was announced that this building is going to be transformed into a data center. I believe Meta will come in and transform this building into a data center. And I'm a little bit concerned about what that means for the water consumption and also for the other energy costs. And then finally, of course, one other challenge is cheating, academic integrity, which is always something that we are concerned about as teachers. So honestly, I feel like I have to kind of make some difficult decisions. I have my own professional crisis. I teach digital technologies, but I have generative artificial intelligence that has all of these challenges. So I'm wondering, how do I teach generative artificial intelligence literacy without compromising my commitment to liberatory pedagogy? And how might my response to generative AI perpetuate educational inequality? In other words, I feel like a lot of us are probably stuck between two different worlds when we're thinking about our response to generative artificial intelligence. Sometimes we have lots of anxieties about generative AI, like the person on the left, or we hear a lot of hype or overhype about generative artificial intelligence and what it's supposed to do. And so, one thing that I want to pose to you all, and you can respond in the audience chat, is where do you position yourself in the slow or sometimes fast authorized and unauthorized integration of Gen AI into writing classrooms if you're in English, but also just in your writing classrooms in general? What's your crisis? How would you describe that? And you can go ahead and post that in the chat, whether you feel a lot of anxiety or if you feel a lot of excitement for generative artificial intelligence. And I'll just wait for a couple of minutes and take a look at the chat and see how people are kind of answering. 100% against AI.
Good deal, everyone. We encourage you to put your responses in the chat, and please know that it'll start moving pretty quickly here shortly. Let's see, anxiety, mixed feelings. I'm in the middle, a little of both. I'm not excited about it.
Okay, yeah, a lot of mixed feelings
Yeah.
that I'm actually noticing in the chat. Yeah. So feel free to continue to kind of answer and kind of scroll through as we're going through here. Because I think that there's lots of anxieties. I see that one comment said that I don't care for it at all, and other folks are really excited. So let's kind of like jump into things then, because I'm trying to work through how I can use generative AI in a way that's still thinking about equity in my classrooms. And I'm also thinking about equity in these tools at the same time. And do they have an impact on inequality when we kind of bring them into our classrooms? So what I'm going to do in this presentation is I'm going to try and kind of think through where we are right now, where we hear a lot of conversation about what AI is supposed to do for the world and what it's supposed to do for education. And I think that AI literacy discourse kind of pushes the kind of an uncritical, what I call a utilitarian technosolutionist approach to teaching. In other words, we're told that Gen AI will be a huge game changer for our educational challenges. And then we can also teach Gen AI to students so that way there will be good workers after they graduate from high school or college. But I think that sometimes that can be kind of like the opposite of what we do in the humanities or in our own teaching, where we're focusing on solving our educational challenges and preparing our students for the workforce can kind of empower our AI companies. And it may actually keep issues of inequality in its place if we're really not being critical about how we can use generative artificial intelligence in our classrooms and to prepare our students on how they can use it outside of the classroom as well. So, as we think about integrating generative artificial intelligence into our curricula, and also as our education institutions buy different licenses for these platforms, we can design teaching strategies using what I call critical digital pedagogy. And these concepts will really help our students to critique AI literacy. We're at a crossroads, I think, where the choices that we make as educators and sometimes the choices that are made by our schools really determines what kind of oppression or inequality that we might get from these tools. So I think we should really be critical and careful on how we're actually using them. So here's what we're going to do for this evening. First, I want to go back and talk a little bit about these different frameworks for liberation and equity, so that way we can feel like we have some power over generative artificial intelligence. And I'm going to be combining liberatory pedagogy with generative artificial intelligence literacies. Then I'll offer some examples of what happens if we don't teach for liberation. In other words, what happens if we just follow the argument that AI is going to solve all of our problems and it's going to be really important for the workforce? And then finally, at the end, I'll show what it looks like when we use critical digital pedagogy as our guide for liberating our students and ourselves, really from the pressures of using generative artificial intelligence. So first, let's kind of talk about some frameworks. I said earlier I like to use liberatory pedagogy, but what is that? What is that? What does that mean? What does that really look like? So I first want to kind of share with you a little research that I'm doing with my students. Really students at the University of Missouri, Kansas City, where I'm really trying to figure out like what do they think about generative AI, especially in the writing classroom specifically. When they have access to it, do they think of themselves as writers, or is there something else that they think about when they use generative artificial intelligence? So I emailed about 7,000 students on campus, and about 579 responded, which is really, really good for busy students. And about 105 were actually interested in follow up interviews to give their opinions about AI. So I'm just kind of sharing some preliminary analysis, but it's really interesting to think about what they really want and desire from their teachers, at least in the college setting. So one of the questions I ask is, do you think that access to AI is a matter of equity, of social justice? And about 46% in total said they either strongly agree or somewhat agree that having access to generative AI is really important. Of course, what does equity mean or social justice mean? That might have different definitions to different students if you don't define it, but it's still a very interesting thing that they're thinking about equity and access. Now, you may be able to kind of make this out, but the next question is asking, should professors teach equitable use of AI or ethical use of AI and prepare them for the workforce after they finish with college? And an overwhelming amount of students, this big orange bar here, that's the longest going across your screen, those are students who strongly agree that, yes, there should be some ethical use of Gen AI, and we should be taught on how we can actually make that happen. So one question here is like, what's really emerging? And I think what's really important is that first, the students who want ethical use of Gen AI instruction really aligns with a lot of nationwide surveys. But it's also interesting that access to Gen AI kind of overlaps with ethical use at the same time. They're kind of tied together. So when we think about access, we're thinking about let's just make sure that we have it on our computers and on our phones. And what we're trying to do is think beyond access and to be more critical about what these tools are doing. So Adam J. Banks, in his book, Race, Rhetoric, and Technology, Searching for Higher Ground, he advocates for us to be a bit more critical when we're using technology in general. He writes, beyond the tools themselves, meaningful access requires users, individually and collectively, to be able to use, critique, resist, design, and change technologies in ways that are relevant to their lives and needs, rather than those of the corporations that hope to actually sell them. So what he suggests is that we don't just think of access as, can I actually have it? Can I load it up on my computer and use it? But thinking about how we can kind of transform what access really looks like. So he has like four different types of access that we should advocate for. The first one is material access. That's the equality in the material conditions that drive technology use or non-use. That goes back to, do you have access to it? Can you actually use it? Functional access is the knowledge and skills necessary to actually use it. So once you have it on your computer, do you know how to use it effectively? Experiential access, that's where things start to get more complicated, because that's asking, can we make these tools relevant to people, to users? And then finally, he says that we have critical access. And that means to understand the benefits and the problems of any technology well enough. So that way we can critique it, resist it, and even decide not to use it at all. And so what he says is that once we combine these different types of access with our students, we then think about transformative access. And he says that transformative access is this genuine inclusion in technology and the networks of power that help determine what they become, but never merely for the sake of inclusion. In other words, we shouldn't just be users of this. Can we be a part of how these things are actually designed or actually made? And that's what we're really thinking about when we're trying to transform our access to generative AI. So that was in 2006. It was like, wait, that was a long time ago. But we're still thinking about that in 2025. I'm still on X, formerly Twitter. So there are a few of us who find great resources. And James Bedford is a scholar that I came across who was talking about access. He wrote, when we talk about equity of access in Gen AI, like, let's take a moment to consider this. Students can freely access the world's most powerful large language models in their pockets, with or without internet, 24/7. The equity issue here is providing the support and education to use these tools responsibly. And I think that that is a great way for us to think about how our students and ourselves, we're really not just customers, but we can also be producers and critics of these very powerful tools at the same time. Okay, so that is teaching for transformative access, but what does that mean for liberatory pedagogy? In other words, if we can critique these tools as we're using them, how do we combine that with this idea of liberation? What is liberatory pedagogy? Can we explain that? Well, I'm taking inspiration from Bell Hooks' Some of you may be very familiar with her work, the book Teaching to Transgress, Education as the Practice of Freedom, and also Adrienne Rich, who wrote an essay back in 1977 claiming an education. And basically, liberatory pedagogy is a holistic approach to teaching in which the environment has students and teachers explore course concepts. But the important thing is that it helps them reach their full potential. And it also helps them to think about, hey, how can I use these concepts as a way to change the world? How can I use it to shape the world into the way that I want to actually live? So we're not just learning to get a good grade or to get a high GPA, although that is very important. We're also trying to think about how can I use this to kind of really transform the world. So what's really important also is that students and both the teacher, we can be vulnerable with each other. We can be open and transparent with each other as well. And so the idea here is for us to kind of think about our relationships with each other as we're trying to change the world with what we're learning in the classroom. So, what about this equitable and inclusive teaching? Well, I think liberatory pedagogy goes very well with equitable and inclusive teaching. When we're being equitable and inclusive, we're really structuring our learning environments to show students that their lived experience and their knowledge, it's welcome, it belongs, and it has value, and it's really contributing to students and teachers' learning. And on the slide, I have posted two really good books that I like, and you might be interested in that: Inclusive Teaching Strategies for Promoting Equity in the College Classroom, and What Inclusive Instructors Do: Principles and Practices for Excellence in College Teaching. Now, I know that I'm an English teacher and I'm a writing teacher, but these books are made for all teachers across all disciplines. So, a really good resource that kind of inspired me to think about inclusive teaching in a world of AI. So, what's the difference between liberation and equity and inclusion? Well, I think that when we really welcome our students and say that their knowledge matters, we're changing narratives on what the classroom experience is. But when we think about liberation, we're thinking about what is education actually for? Again, grades are really important, but we really want to think about how knowledge can be used in a way that's really making the world a better place for all of us. So I want to know, how about you? What does equitable teaching, inclusive teaching, or maybe you're thinking, hey, I do liberatory teaching. What does that look like in your classroom? How does it apply when you teach various different types of technologies, if that is something that is applicable to you if you are teaching writing? But where you are in your discipline, how do you try to do equitable, inclusive teaching? And you can go ahead and post that down in the audience chat, and we'll kind of take a look about where what you all are talking about. Okay, using strategies to support all learners. Yes. Finding ways that students learn and finding a way to reach individual students. Yes. And it could be something as simple as learning all students' names. I know that is a very, common sense thing, but that's something that was suggested. It's very powerful when someone knows your name and they know your face. That's how you know that you actually belong. Sometimes it takes me a few weeks to remember everyone's names, to put it with faces, though. Differentiated learning, scaffolding. Yes. So it looks like our relationships with our students are really important. And that is where everything should really start, regardless of whatever technology comes into our own classrooms. So my point is that when we think about generative AI, and it's like, well, what do I do? How do I respond to this? I like to think that years ago, from people like Bell Hooks to Adrian Rich, we already have the frameworks for responding to new technologies like this. And we don't have to have as much anxiety when we can actually think, hey, how exactly can I be really critical about this by prioritizing my relationships with my students first? So, one thing I'm also thinking about, though, is the other side of our relationships with our students is that sometimes our response to Gen AI might also undermine both transformative access and liberatory pedagogy. And I mean by using like surveillance technologies like AI detectors, or if we're very quick to sending our students up to the administration because we think that they have violated academic integrity. And I think that sometimes that can actually undermine our mission, really, to do transformative access. So I want to go ahead and stop here for a moment and just uh, switch things around and ask, what are some questions and comments that you have so far? You can post that down in the QA session, and I will answer a couple of questions, and then we can kind of move forward. But what are some questions or comments that you have about transformative access and equity in our teaching?
Good deal. And thank you for that, Dr. Byrd. Again, everyone, we encourage you. I see you all are still responding to the earlier question about equity, inclusivity measures that you're taking in the classroom as well. And shout out to everyone. And as I mentioned before, the chat can move pretty quickly, but everything from differentiated instruction to different approaches for students who are learning at different levels, whether you're teaching PE, whether you're teaching math, whether you're teaching history as well. So, again, thank you so much for that. Dr. Byrd, I will continue to monitor the audience chat as well for any questions that'll come up.
Okay, yeah, that sounds good. Yeah, happy to answer any questions. And there will be some time at the very end to do a Q&A. So if I kind of move along, feel free to still put your question down there, and we'll have some time to respond to them as well.
And one question that we had from Patricia is, how do you deal with people that use the terminology of equity but don't really practice it in their classroom? So
Mm,
that's I'll also submit that to the teachers who are in the audience as well. So how do you deal with people that use the terminology of equity but not, in fact, putting it in practice? I have a second question as well, Dr. Byrd. I'm not sure if you want to weigh in on the first one there.
okay, yeah, that is a very good question. And my very first thought is I would kind of approach that person and kind of ask them, what do you think? How would you define equity? What does equity look like to you? And then proceed from there to get an understanding of their definition. And I think I would also then kind of compare notes. What do you do in your classroom? Well, this is what I do in my classroom, and I think that this is what equity looks like. So then it then becomes a kind of a conversation, even a resource sharing with someone who says, "Well, I'm doing equity, but this is what it looks like." Not to bring more complex terms or anything, but I think of something called contract grading, which is the idea that students can sign up for their grade, and they know that they have to complete certain tasks to get that grade. So if a student says, I want an A, And then you say, well, this is what's required in order for you to get that A. Some people will say that, hey, that's a form of equity, but there are some questions about if that actually supports students who have lots of resources already. Like, for example, they don't have to support their kids and they don't have to work two jobs. That would be very easy for a student to get an A. But it may not be very equitable because other students say, well, the best I can do is get a C plus. So I think having a conversation would be really good and then sharing notes. And hopefully from that, there's a learning opportunity that can happen. So that's a really good question. I have not considered that. Yeah.
Yeah. Uh, Robert's question is, in what ways can students use generative AI in the classroom that does not allow for taking the work of others and submitting it as their own? Doesn't support uh, for generative AI in the classroom condone support for the technology itself, which is a job killer?
Okay, that is also a good question. In what ways can students use generative AI in the classroom that does not allow for taking the work of others and submitting it as their own? And I think that goes very well with a couple of strategies that I actually use. One of the things, going back to that idea of liberatory pedagogy. So, what does that look like in my classroom? One thing that I do is actually kind of start with our values. I do something called a values affirmation activity, and this is actually coming. This is not my original idea, but the idea is to kind of set the standard. What are your expectations for learning in our classroom? What do you find that's really important? And then afterwards, what does that look like in our classroom? So if you value creativity, okay, great. So what does that look like in our classroom? Or if you say, well, I really value respect. We should respect each other. Okay, so what does that look like in terms of our behavior? How should we actually respect each other? And so what I try to do is kind of get a sense of, hey, this is what we really value that we bring to the classroom, and also what we think is really important from education. And we kind of use that as a way to set a standard. The other thing that I do is that I give students the option to use Gen AI. So I teach them through a online video. It's about 20 minutes or so about what Gen AI is, and then I explicitly show them for certain assignments, not for all of them, but for some writing assignments, I explicitly tell them, here's one way that you can use generative artificial intelligence for research, or here's another way that you can use it for peer review. That last one is a big deal because I have to tell students, do not put your peer's essay into Gen AI because we don't know how it's using that. So that is a really important point that I learned that I had to bring up last semester when I learned that students were just uploading each other's papers as a way to help them. But I told them, you should not do that. That's something not to do. So those are a couple of things that I try to do so they're not submitting their work of others and submitting it as their own. The values, and then also being explicit about what they can actually do for it.
Mm. Good deal. Thank you, Dr. Byrd. We have a few more questions, but we'll move ahead. And
Yeah.
at your next break, we'll present the other questions. So, everyone who submitted a question, we will return to them here shortly. Thank you again.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you so much for those questions. And so this is where I want to talk about next. It's the two challenges to doing liberatory pedagogy, or what happens when we don't seek liberation. And so here I'm just thinking about, okay, what are the consequences if I kind of lean into the hype? What might be some of the issues that actually gets in the way of doing transformative access? So there are two things that I think can happen, and both of them kind of lean into that some legacies that both education and also ed technology companies have contributed to. If we don't really respond with liberation, we might actually accidentally continue some of these legacies that impact our students. So the first one I'll talk about is called Is It a Crisis or Is It Just Linguistic Racism? And then the second troubling legacy is it a game changer or just capitalism? I feel like it's almost like a game show that we're playing. So first, is it a crisis or just linguistic racism? So I'm thinking here about the different ways that sometimes we do still emphasize that students should write in standard English or speak in standard English, even though we know that we have diverse students in our classrooms who come with all types of linguistic practices and languages. And really, all of those are really valuable in how they can express their knowledge and what they really know. But I kind of wonder if we kind of put a lot of prohibition on the use of Gen AI, do we try to force a standard way of using different types of technologies in the classroom? So, in thinking about standard English and how English education has contributed to really telling our students, hey, the way that you speak or write from your own culture or from your own ethnicity doesn't really apply here. I want to put up this quote that comes from April Baker Bell, Farzine Ahmed, and Dan Clayton. They write in an editorial that is from the journal English and Education. The field of English education and English classrooms have also historically reinforced language colonization and have been instrumental in the crafting and maintenance of linguistic and racial inequality. So, one way to bring maintenance or to control is to bring in a literacy crisis. So, a literacy crisis, as John Trimber explains, is a story of the widespread, rapid decline in literacy to levels supposedly held by the uneducated poor, a decline which threatened to erode the power of the middle class. So, he goes on to explain a little bit more about what exactly this literacy crisis looks like. John Trimber writes that the discourse of literacy crises engages deep seated cultural anxieties and attempts to resolve them magically by regulating the production and use of literacy, drawing lines between standard English and popular vernaculars, masters and servants. Middle class anxieties about loss of status and downward mobility have repeatedly been displaced and refigured in the realm of language practices and literacy education. So, John Trimber is saying that sometimes when we're concerned about literacy, it's really concerned about different people speaking and they come into the classroom with these different types of language practices. I like to think of this quote from my old mentor, Dr. Elizabeth Woodworth. And she was the director of composition when I was a master's student at Auburn University at Montgomery. And I remember that she said one day, there's always a literacy crisis. We're always concerned about students reading and writing and how technology is changing how they read and write. And I'm not suggesting that we don't have a literacy crisis or that we don't have some serious issues in education. There was a recent report that showed that since COVID, students have regained their losses on math achievement tests, but the reading levels are still low after the pandemic. And so I think what I am trying to say here is that we really need to know what's the real literacy crisis, and then what's our real equitable response that we can have to our students when we think there is a crisis of some kind. So, to make this a little bit more concrete, we can look to history, why Johnny can't write, or linguistic injustice. In the 60s and the 70s, we have things like the GI Bill is already in use in the Higher Education Act, which was spearheaded by Lyndon B. Johnson. And the whole idea was to make college accessible to more people, to veterans and marginalized people. Granted, white veterans benefited more from the GI Bill than black veterans. But the idea was that college education is a good thing for the nation. But the civil rights movement and the Vietnam War protests made a lot of, say, middle class elites concerned about how well people really supported democracy in the United States, even though that we were really arguing for more rights, more liberation as promised through the Constitution. And so one of the things that they did is that they blamed these writing teachers who were really trying to adopt how they teach students from different cultural backgrounds, who were bringing different kinds of languages in the classroom. And they argued that we need to go back to basics. We need to learn just grammar and we need to learn standard English. So, one real example of that to solve this so called crisis is the elements of style. Some of you may be familiar with it. It's a very popular book. When I was in the 12th grade, I wanted to become a better writer. And my English teacher told me, you should get the elements of style. And I ate up the elements of style all through college until I was an undergraduate. And my friend of mine, my then roommate, said, I think those rules that are in the elements of style, they actually kind of stifle your writing. They don't make your writing very dynamic. And so the issue here is that there seems to be kind of like a middle brow pedagogy that E.B. White was trying to write for. When he published this book, he wrote for the New Yorker, and they were teaching their readers of middle class professionals how to be smart across culture, art, and literature. E.B. White also was promoting that we put identity and lived experience out of our minds and just think more about clear prose. And so this worked very well for a time when we were concerned about communism in the Cold War era, but it was also aligning with the idea that a good citizen is also white. And then you have some professional organizations like the National Council of Teachers of English and the Conference on College Composition and Communication. They really use that concern about communism as a way to get federal research funding to study writing. Laura Elizabeth is the one who really points these things out, and she says really that writing in the academy, it can reinforce racial systems, and it can also reinforce this idea that meritocracy is all that matters, while sometimes ignoring racism in education. But it also means that there can be sometimes a passing allyship. And what that means is that sometimes we can show that we really do support equity and justice, but when it becomes a little too inconvenient or it puts us in danger, we then kind of take that back. So, in looking back at this history, a well known scholar, Carmen Kennard, has a great blog post where she's thinking about the arrival of AI. And she says we had other choices back then, but y'all ain't heroes though. School literacy, white English, academic discourse, bourgeoisie Western rhetoric, and education are so standardized and robotic that robots do it better now. Robots have come home to their roosts, and I don't feel sad or scared about none of it. So, what she's saying is that we had a choice where we could have different types of writing and really emphasize different types of languages, but we ended up using standard English. And that's exactly what large language models are using in their training data. So these tools, they can continue that legacy of racism, of linguistic racism, and how they're actually designed. For example, for ChatGPT 3, 93% of the training data is in English. When we think about how the data is actually filtered out, for example, the designers make sure that certain slurs that have actually been reclaimed by marginalized people are filtered out of the systems. If the data comes from Reddit, there's a lot of training data that comes from the Reddit. The issue with that is that a lot of marginalized users have issues with the moderators who are on Reddit, and they get pushed out. So their voices are not included in the training data. And then finally, social movements like Black Lives Matter. If the media doesn't cover these movements, they're not going to be in the training data, and so they may not be very well represented. So the idea here is that the way that we've actually taught writing can be very influential to the designers of AI. And these tools are great. These books aren't terrible, but I think that unfortunately it kind of pushes out how students are really able to use their different types of languages in the writing classroom and not just standard English. So finally, I'm kind of wondering if we kind of ban Gen AI from our classrooms, do we do a disservice to our students? Does that mean that our students may not be as well versed or thinking critically about artificial intelligence? This book on the right hand side is really good. It's called Digital Divisions: How Schools Create Inequality and in the Tech Era. And the author, Matthew Ruffalo, he argues that in schools, in public schools, he noticed that a lot of teachers would really let, say, the white students use their digital technologies in very creative ways. But they also noticed that teachers would not give the same kind of permission to their black and brown students, even though that they were very creative with technology, they were not allowed to do that. So sometimes we may actually be doing more harm to our students if we're not able to really teach them how to use it, generative AI, in a proper way. So I want to pause again at this break and kind of see if there are any questions for this moment where we're kind of thinking about how exactly we might actually recreate some issues with large language models.
Good deal. Thank you for that. Aaron's question. I understand the importance of not accusing students of academic integrity violations, but I'm trying to understand how to balance that with potential learning and skill loss if students are not actually doing the work. It's more of a comment, but wanted to see if you uh, had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, that is a really good point to bring up. How to actually how to balance that with potential learning and skill loss if students are not actually doing the work. Um, yeah, I think one thing that I'm thinking about, and I think this kind of goes back to what I was saying before about relationships with students, is having that conversation about, and this might be something that takes time in the classroom. What do we think is a really good use of generative artificial intelligence? And what do you think is actually taking away from our learning and also our thinking? That's something that I kind of think about off the top of my head when I see this particular comment on trying to understand how to balance not accusing students of academic violations while making sure they're actually not losing out on that experience. And I think that's always the best way is to be upfront with our students in talking about what can we do with this, what do we think is taking away from our learning, and that kind of transparency might be one way to kind of build that environment.
All right. All right. Thank you. Thank you. Um, the next question is about tools. What are some AI tools that you are or have implemented within your course, or how did you frame it from a liberatory lens?
Oh
How did you
yeah.
frame the use? Yes.
Yeah, so you're kind of anticipating some of my slides. So one of the things that I do for my students, and this is for research, I use something called Research Rabbit. And so Research Rabbit is basically a student can take, say, a PDF of an article, and then they can put that into Research Rabbit, and what Research Rabbit then does is that it tries to kind of search for all of the articles that are related to that article. It's almost like Google Scholar, but the difference is that it creates like a map, a web of all of the different articles that is related to that particular article that they uploaded. And so from there, students can really have an idea on how they can do their literature review. The only issue, of course, is that they actually have to read those articles and they have to choose which articles in that map can be really helpful. Another way that I try to kind of frame it as liberation is kind of thinking about the consequences that come with using these different types of tools to our thinking, to our critical thinking. That if we rely on it too much, we actually are not really great decision makers. There's actually some articles that show that if we rely too much on generative AI, we're not really making real critical thinking decisions at all. And so that's really important if we're trying to make a change in our world. Do we really want generative AI to decide what kind of world that we want to live in? Or should that actually be human beings who do that? And I actually share a little bit more in the slides on what that can actually look like. So that is a really good question that kind of anticipates some things that are coming up.
Oh, okay. Question from Jason. Is there a transition point with generative AI that it is meant to start learning from all input rather than just programming from the tech world? Do you see that as a way to settle discrepancies in discriminatory programming? Is there a transition point with generative AI that it is meant to start learning from all input rather than just programming from the tech world?
Yeah, I think this is a really good thing because I thought about this. Is so I think that the AI does learn from the inputs, and I know sometimes we don't have a lot of time to look at the terms of service. We just click accept and we start using it. But I think that we can actually kind of read from the terms of service if they're using the input. And I think that's a really interesting thing. For that second part of the question, do you see that as a way to settle discrepancies in discriminatory programming? And I think that there is. If we kind of think about what do we put out into the world when we are writing things online and on the internet, and what we actually input into these tools, it's like can we kind of be more responsible in what it is that we are putting out there? I call this truth telling. In other words, if we're writing online and we know that AI is being used to take our writing and using as training data, can we kind of put out some of the facts of our existence as marginalized people, for example, onto the internet? I know that's probably really idealistic, but I think that what we write that is actually more about justice can be something that could be put into the training data. So I think that's the best way to do that if we're kind of thinking about the discrepancies in that programming. But we only have so much control over the design of these tools, unfortunately.
All right. Thank you all for your questions. I may have maybe one or two more that we'll save for the end. And also, I want to commend you all on just the exchanges and the collegiality that's happening in the chat as well, responding to each other's questions in the chat. So we appreciate that. And we'll move ahead. It's a little bit after 8 o'clock here in the East, 7 over there in Central. So we'll move ahead. Thank you so much.
Yeah. And so finally, before we kind of get into critical digital pedagogy, I want to kind of talk about the other ways that transformative access might be undermined by our uncritical use of Gen AI. And is it a game changer or just capitalism? So I would like this quote from Kate Crawford from her book, Atlas of AI. She writes in the introduction that artificial intelligence as we know it depends entirely on a much wider set of political social structures. And due to the capital required to build AI at scale, in the ways of seeing that it optimizes AI systems are ultimately designed to serve existing dominant interests. In other words, she thinks that artificial intelligence is a registry of power, that it puts companies in positions of power when we're actually using them. So ultimately, what that means is that generative AI is an extension of a lot of companies and profit already, and it kind of gives them a lot of power in the process. A really good example is when our president, Donald Trump, made an announcement a few weeks ago about a new AI infrastructure project investing $500 billion in data centers. And these are some CEOs who will be part of that effort. So lots of money going into building AI, right? That's going to go to these companies. OpenAI in the last part of the year posted a blog, and they basically say in this quote, "We need more money. We need hundreds of billions of dollars in order to keep making these systems." Now, if you're familiar with DeepSeek, then you know that that particular company from China said, "Hey, we made AI, and it only took a few $1,000,000." Some people kind of dispute if that's really true, but ultimately, these companies are saying we need billions of dollars. So universities are sometimes part of that effort to increase the profit for a lot of companies. And you may be familiar with this already if you're in the California area. So an example is that AI is supposed to come in and really help all of our problems in education. And it's going to be a game changer for us. This is an image of AI coming in to save the world, by the way, created by DALL-E E3. So basically, these CEOs have a lot of hope for what AI is supposed to do. This is the CEO for NVIDIA, and he's basically saying that AI is going to be one of the greatest contributions to social elevation. It's going to lift all people who have been historically left behind. So you're essentially going to have a tutor that's going to be there at all times. And I think the ability for AI to elevate all the people left behind is quite extraordinary. Another example from Sam Altman, who said in 2024, just last year, he has the same idea that AI can be a helpful, personalized tutor that will help accelerate students' learning in a way that is only accessible to a small number of people. And if we can democratize that and we can make that something that's widely available to learners, I think that'd be tremendous. So this sounds really great on the surface to really have a democratized AI systems. But if we're kind of critical about it, we want to think about, how do these companies understand learning and what that really means? For example, giving us personalized tutors or personalized curricular design, completing tedious tasks for teachers, but also being used to monitor our labor. What are we doing? And how long does it take us to do things? And also help us solve complex problems. Now, I'm not saying that this is all bad. I do like it that I can go to Gen AI and I can come up with discussion questions. I have a hard time coming up with discussion questions. But we also kind of have to think about what are the consequences are for this partnership to our teachers. I know that California State University system, for example, made a big announcement about this partnership, I think, with OpenAI. And it's happening while there are lots of cuts to faculty positions and lower enrollment. So those of you who are in California may be familiar with this already. So we want to kind of be thinking about, do we lose something if we're adopting AI so quickly in our curricula? So we've done this before, actually. Some of you may remember MOOCs, which are these massive online courses where thousands of people can take it for free. This was a thing back in the 2010s, and it was supposed to revolutionize education, but no one really uses MOOCs anymore, or they do exist, but they didn't have that big educational change that a lot of people had hoped for in 2012. When computers came onto the scene in the 80s and 90s, that was supposed to be a big game changer. The internet was supposed to be a big game changer, but we are still here teaching our students. We haven't been replaced. So sometimes the technologies make promises, but it's an open question if they really deliver on those promises. So very quickly, I think that this is what I think might be the real crisis if we're not very critical of AI tools that we get. We have to ask ourselves, first, Gen AI, it can blur a consumer product with a pedagogical tool. And we have to ask ourselves, who does this technology really serve when it enters our classrooms? And then we also have to ask ourselves, well, what are the biases? We talked about that before, where large language models focus on standard English, and we may have some concerns about, does that really reinforce what we think good writing is? And then finally, we want to think about if we believe what we get from these tools. In other words, are they really exploiting us if we trust the outputs that we get? And how does that really influence the kind of decisions that we make? So I think what we really want is that transformative access for liberation. And how can we actually do that knowing that large language models pose so many challenges to us? So, as a way to kind of wrap things up and then answer questions at the end, I'm going to present to you critical digital pedagogy and how that can be used for us to critique AI as we're kind of bringing it into our classrooms, and we can do that with our students. Critical digital pedagogy actually brings together bell hooks and Paulo Freire's work, if you're familiar with pedagogy of the oppressed. And the idea here, according to Jesse Stomel, is that critical digital pedagogy is a reflective teaching practice that inspects digital tools, understanding them, reading them as part of the world of education. And what's really important is that we're asking questions about power, access, and technology. And that's really at the center of our practice. I really love this book, Critical Digital Pedagogy in Higher Education. I know we have lots of folks from Los Angeles teaching in public schools, but I think this is a really great resource for everyone. And I love this quote from the editors of this book, where they say, we're talking about the humanization of education. And notice that this quote goes back to some of the things that we found really valuable is affirming our students and our educators as whole persons. We have cultural backgrounds and emotions, and all of that should be coming into the classroom as a way to support us as learners. Humanization is a starting point for the nurturing of students as critical and compassionate human beings, able and willing to imagine different and better possibilities for themselves and others, including the material world. There seems to be a need to define more clearly and perhaps rethink our relationship with the digital to widen such possibilities. And I like to think that what that means is that when we have AI, we should ask ourselves, does this really improve my relationships with my students? Is this really going to improve our relationships with the concepts that we're teaching in the classroom? So we can ask our students a different question. Yes, sure, we can use these tools, but we have to ask ourselves, what kind of world do you want? And how can AI help you achieve that kind of world? And sometimes we have to be honest and ask ourselves this question and answer it by saying, well, it doesn't. It really doesn't help improve the world that I really want. And so, this question here above, how does AI help you achieve the kind of world that you want, is the core of what we can do with our students and also for ourselves as teachers. So ultimately, I think this idea of critical digital pedagogy can empower us and avoids us from falling into the AI literacy crisis, which is really just a lot of hype, and really be thinking about how can this really figure into our classrooms in a very critical way. So here are some overlapping values that are really important for critical digital pedagogy. I'm just going to go talk through these, and I'm going to show you what they actually look like as reflective questions for the design of your classes when you're thinking about using Gen AI. First, shared learning and trust. This value means that we're trying to challenge the teacher-student relationship, where the teacher has authority and the student is just sitting in the chair listening to what we have to say. Instead, we're trying to kind of think about how we can connect to each other as a learning community. So we have to ask ourselves, how do we create trust in learning environments that doesn't use AI detectors? And then how does the ed tech tools we actually use, How is that collecting data about our students, about what we are actually doing with our own writing? And should we be using that in our classrooms? When we talk about critical consciousness with our students, that means just being very aware of what the problems are with these technologies. So, kind of going back to those challenges to AI with hallucination and dangers to the climate. What resources do AI platforms actually need to function? So, what training data does it actually need? And how does this resource extraction harm our learning, our environment, and our creativity? Critical questions to ask so we're more aware of Gen AI and what it does. Now, the last two is very hopeful. Change. Okay, we've critiqued these tools, but what can we do in terms of change? And what this means is asking ourselves, is there any kind of liberating potential for AI? What do we need liberation from in our classrooms? And can AI actually be a useful tool to helping that liberation happen? And again, it is important and okay for us to say, well, no, it doesn't really help me with the liberation that I'm seeking for my students that promotes equity and inclusion. And the last one is hope. Hope and change, they can kind of go together. And the editors of that book, Critical Pedagogy in Higher Education, they admit that hope and change are really close to each other. But hope means a desire for things to be different and better, a desire that becomes a possibility. And it's an optimistic endeavor. So, this is kind of like a thought experiment with students. What exactly can we take up as optimistic with generative AI in our classrooms? What type of hope do we have for the world that these tools may actually bring us? And again, if the answer is, well, I don't think it's actually bringing about the world that I want, then that is okay. So this is me, how I kind of think through these values. And this is my hope as we go into the world of generative AI and as I continue to teach my students these different types of technologies. First, when it comes to learning and trust, I really hope that we as teachers choose our relationships with our students over the technology. And that's whether you're in a writing classroom or you teach writing or a different concept. That I think is really important. It's the relationships. My hope is that for critical consciousness, we understand that Gen AI is not just a tool for trying to help us learn with, but it also connects to these tech companies that might be really generating a lot of profit when they come and bring it to our classrooms. Change, what I really hope is that we use something called open source generative AI. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the examples coming up in that slide. So hold on for one moment and you'll get an idea of what that means. And then finally, hope. I know we're concerned about like copy and pasting and students using that for discussion posts. But what I really hope is that if we have to use Gen AI, we can use it for thinking. How exactly can we think with these tools? Because I think that's the hard part with education. It's thinking. I, as a writer, have a hard time writing because it's really hard to think. And so I wonder if Gen AI, it can be useful for us to think very clearly about what we want to write or the concepts that we're trying to learn. And so this is what my previous slide was about, those open source tools. I know that we're concerned about ChatGPT and Gemini and a lot of the other big popular artificial intelligence tools, but I have learned that there are lots of open source tools. So these are different types of AI that you can actually download to your computer, and you don't have to worry about these companies getting access to your personal data. You can worry less about the energy consumption, and you can also use it without using the internet. GPT for all is really cool because you can upload your own documents and files. I'm going to start using it as a way to brainstorm because I take lots of notes when I'm doing data analysis. LM Studio is also really cool. You can actually download different models, different types of AI to your computer, and you can use it without using the internet. And then finally, Hugging Chat. Now, this is really cool. It's the same as LM Studio, but the difference is that it tells you which of the models will collect data and send it to the company. So you can choose the ones that doesn't actually collect your student data and sends it to the company that actually made it. The quote above, I think, really gets at the heart of what open source AI might do for us. These big companies like OpenAI, they give us a rocket ship so we can visit the grocery store. That's how my friend put it. And we really don't need a rocket ship to get to the grocery store. We just need a bike, or we need our car, or just the bus. So why should we use these tools that take up so much energy when we can just have it on our laptop and we can do very simple things and think with these different types of tools? So really cool things to experiment, and we don't really have to use ChatGPT in order to learn how to use Gen AI. So this is where I've landed on in terms of trying to get through the challenges. I think it's important to teach Gen AI to our students. I think we can do some type of ethical way of doing that. And I think using these types of open source tools on our computers can kind of mitigate some of the concerns that we have. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and open things up to any questions. I see we have 10 minutes left. So that's really good. We have time.
Absolutely. Thank you so very much. So insightful. Let me see. I'm going to scroll back up here. There were a few. And there was a question about actually some of the actions of the new administration from earlier, Emily. Her question is, how will this be addressed with the new administration in the event the Department of Education is dissolved? Will there be some sort of common guidelines for all states in regards to teaching Gen AI critically?
Yeah.
Question focuses on those idea of common guidelines. I know that's been the subject of discussion, particularly in our institutes as well.
Yeah, the guidelines is so difficult. And I'm kind of sorry this happened. The previous administration, and there was an AI Bill of Rights that the Biden administration had created and posted online. And I think that was a very useful way to think about generative artificial intelligence and how we should think about that in terms of education. And unfortunately, that website was taken down a few weeks ago after the new administration came in. So if the downloaded PDF version of that is still circulating, I know people probably have that. I think that's a really good resource. Um, I'm not entirely sure if we will have common guidelines because there are so many different disciplines and so many different views. It is a hope that I have that if something were to happen to the Department of Education, that we do get a consistent guidance from the state level for public school and also for universities. Uh, but I know that there's every different institution is so different. Like at UMKC, we are doing like a really grassroots approach to policy creation. We don't have a lot of guidance from our UM system, the University of Missouri system, so we're kind of on our own at the moment. But it's something that I really do hope that we have some consistent guidelines in the event that happens. So it's a hope. I think that's my best answer. I hope it happens, but it's really hard.
Yes, I agree with you 100% on that one. Um, Eric had a question. He posted a little bit earlier. How would you introduce Gen AI to students who are not comfortable using their critical thinking skills yet? I feel using that skill allows one to take full advantage of all the benefits of the supports AI can give. This question of the introduction, and you covered this in some of your points. As I said before, this is a question that we had pretty early on, but I wanted to make sure I circle back. Um, and
Hmm.
submitted it to you.
Yeah.
Methods
Yeah.
to introduce.
Yeah. I think how would we introduce students who are not comfortable using their critical thinking skills yet? Um, yeah. I'm kind of thinking about a couple of things at the moment in response to that question, and thinking about how exactly, like you said in that second part, you said, I feel that using that skill allows one to take full advantage of all the benefits of the supports that AI can give. One thing I think is really important is kind of doing that critical thinking together. That they do have those tools, and I guess maybe that's my answer to all the things that relationships and doing things together. So, for example, one assignment that I have for my students is something called they compare summaries of their summaries that they have of an executive order by the Biden administration that explains really how we should respond to the use of generative artificial intelligence. So students summarize that just like a little paragraph, a little snippet of that executive order. And then they take that same paragraph and they ask something like ChatGPT to summarize it. And then this is a way where they can start doing that critical thinking of what these tools actually do. And that could be like a group effort to do that in the classroom, where students are kind of critically thinking like what's different between how you summarized it and how that Chat GPT summarized it. What's really missing? I can tell you that when my students did it, they said that, hey, a lot of the context is missing. Or I think ChatGPT, it just actually summarized it for seventh graders because they were supposed to make it readable to a seventh grade reading level. So I would introduce it kind of like as a group effort with guided questions that kind of brings out those critical thinking skills as the best way, and to kind of show them, hey, you actually are doing this in the right kind of way. So I like that idea of a community learning effort.
Absolutely, and I think that goes to a question that Miguel has as well. And Miguel's question came in as you were responding, but his question is, how do you see generative AI being used to support students who receive special education services? And I think that kind of flows directly from your response just now in terms of instructional approaches. How do you
Hmm.
see it being used for students who receive special education services?
Yeah, I actually had some students, and this is kind of anecdotal. I've had some students in my own classrooms who have shared with me how they've actually used AI when they have a disability. And it's also is something that showed up in some of my research data. You know, that survey that I shared a little bit earlier, there were questions, open-ended questions for students. And so one of the things that I know that have been useful for students is kind of like that summary function, where it is kind of difficult for them to really focus as they're reading. And they actually found it useful to use generative AI to kind of summarize some of the text itself. And I know that sometimes we have those types of concerns about using AI to summarize or to get at key points. But things like even Chat GPT for all, for example, does a good job of taking something that already exists and kind of summarizing it. And I think that's really important too. I have heard instances at UMKC where students with disabilities have found it very useful to use generative AI. But the issue is that the teacher has such a strong prohibitive policy that the student can't even really use it, and that has brought up questions about accessibility here at UMKC, telling students we know that this has been useful for you, but this particular professor has this policy, so you should be aware if you take this class that you're not able to use Gen AI at all in this kind of way. So it really is disappointing that we're so concerned about it with our anxiety that it is a point of a way of showing their knowledge through using these tools. So it can be very supportive, but I'm a little concerned that our policies may leave our students behind when they find it useful for them.
All right, we have about 2 more minutes, and I will use that time again to thank Dr. Byrd for being here for us. And, I have enjoyed our conversations over the past, I guess, almost a year, and I look forward to continuing to build with you. As I'm looking at the chat, everyone is extremely appreciative of you and this session, and just how relatable you were, and so we appreciate you. And we are going to close. Any final remarks? Anything else you would like to share with the teachers before we close out?
Yeah, I just want to say thank you so much again for taking the time to come on here and share your time with the webinar. And I really do believe that the biggest thing I want to say is that we have the expertise that collectively our years of experience is a really key resource for our students. And it's the relationships. That's something that I've come to learn in my years of teaching, of how important relationships are with students. So I just want to end on that point of encouragement that we have the experience and the expertise, and we really should advocate for ourselves as these tools keep coming into our classrooms, whether we like it or not.
Yes, it's well received, and to everyone again, I encourage you to continue to follow all the updates from Dr. Byrd, and again, he will be with us this summer. To all of you all who will be joining us in Lawrence, Kansas, I encourage you all to follow us, continue to stay updated of all events at the National Humanities Center. Follow us on our social media channels, and I'd encourage you all again to support the humanities education programs. We provide a bridge between the academic world and the working classroom. Your gift, no matter how modest, can open up a world of ideas for teachers and rekindle their enthusiasm for the subjects they teach by providing the knowledge and tools that they and their students need to make a difference. Every gift of support is appreciated. So next up, we have Dr. Nishani Frazier, who's Director of Public History out at North Carolina State University. She will be joining us on February 20th at 7 p.m. Who Has the Body? Mapping and Preserving the History of African American Cemeteries. Again, Nishani has worked with us on several projects before, and it's great to have her join us virtually here. And we wish you all well. Continue to enjoy your week in Black History Month. And to those of you who are in the chilly area, stay warm. And again, those of you who are out in LA and Southern California, we hope that you continue to get the rain that you also desperately need. If I can assist you all with anything, please do not hesitate to reach out to me, M. Williams at nationalhumanitiescenter.org. And as always, it is a joy, it's an honor and a privilege to be here for this with you all, for this time with you all. Take care, be well, and we will chat very, very soon.